Hey there, welcome to Quiet History. Imagine trying to fall asleep tonight. No mattress, no pillow, no blanket, just a pile of dirty straw on a hard wooden floor, in a freezing, cramped room, surrounded by other people. That's exactly how millions of people slept every single night in medieval times. So how did they actually survive this? And what was it really like to sleep without a bed?
Before the first electric filament ever glowed, before gas lamps lined cobbled streets, before even the tallow candle became a reliable fixture of ordinary households, there existed a darkness so complete, so indifferent, and so absolute that the modern mind can scarcely reconstruct it. This was the darkness of medieval Europe, not the manageable dimness of a power outage or a clouded night in a modern city, but a darkness without boundary or apology, a darkness that swallowed roads, fields, villages, and the people within them whole every single night for centuries. Between 1200 and 1400 AD, the landscape of Western Europe was a patchwork of agricultural settlements, dense forest and stone-built ecclesiastical structures rising above the tree line, like the only permanent things in a world of impermanence. Villages clustered along river valleys and cleared land, connected by unpaved tracks that turned to mud in wet seasons and froze into rutted channels in winter. The fields surrounding these settlements were worked from earliest light to the last usable hour of afternoon, and the labor that filled those hours was total, bodies bent to soil, hands pulling at root and grain, feet moving across ground that was never level, never soft, never forgiving. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, the quality of light across this landscape changed in ways that were not merely aesthetic, but deeply consequential. The long shadows of late afternoon stretched across harvested fields and bare earth paths. The tree lines at the edges of cleared land darkened first, the interior of the forest becoming impenetrable, while the sky above still held color. Then the sky itself surrendered, the pale grey of dusk thickening into something denser, the last visible detail of the landscape, flattening and dissolving until there was nothing left to see at all. There were no street lamps at the edges of village paths. There were no lanterns hung at doorways in any reliable or widespread sense. For the vast majority of the population, the peasant labourers, the subsistence farmers, the rural poor, who constituted the overwhelming bulk of medieval Europe's inhabitants, the arrival of full dark meant the cessation of almost all activity outside the walls of their dwellings. The night was not navigable. It was simply endured. The dwellings into which these bodies retreated at nightfall were structures that the modern eye would struggle to recognize as habitable. Wattle and daub construction dominated the peasant landscape. Walls built from a lattice of woven branches and stakes, packed and plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung that dried into a surface both rough and fragile. These walls were not sealed against the elements in any meaningful sense. Wind moved through them. Cold penetrated them. Moisture worked its way through the plaster over time, leaving dark stains and soft patches that crumbled at the touch. The roofs above these walls were thatched, dense layers of bundled straw or reed laid over a timber frame, effective at shedding rain when new and properly maintained, but subject to gradual deterioration, to the infiltration of insects and small animals, to the slow compression and decay that turned a functional roof into a source of dripping moisture and structural uncertainty. The ceiling height within these structures was low enough that a person of average height moved through the interior space with a constant awareness of the beams above, darkened to near black by years of accumulated smoke. The floors of these dwellings were earth, not flagstone, not timber planking, not any material that implied deliberate construction, simply the ground itself, packed hard by repeated foot traffic, worn smooth in the areas of heaviest use, uneven and cracked at the margins. This earthen floor was the surface upon which the majority of medieval Europe's rural population spent its nights. It was cold in a way that stone is cold, a cold that radiated upward from below, that moved through any material placed upon it, that settled into a body lying horizontal and did not release. At the center of this interior space, or positioned against one wall, depending on the dwelling's configuration, was the hearth. In the simplest peasant structures, this was not a fireplace in any architectural sense. No stone surround, no chimney drawing smoke upward and out. It was an open fire, built on flat stones or directly on the earthen floor, its smoke rising freely into the interior air and accumulating at ceiling level before finding its way out through a hole in the thatch or through the countless gaps in the walls and roof structure. The smoke did not leave cleanly. It lingered. It settled into every surface, every material, every fiber of clothing and bedding, and the hair and skin of every person within the space. In the hours before full dark, this fire served as the dwelling's primary light source, a dim, orange-red glow that illuminated a small radius of interior space, while leaving the corners and edges of the room in deep shadow. The light it cast was not steady. It moved with the fire, throwing shifting shadows across the low ceiling, making the interior feel simultaneously smaller and more uncertain than it was. Beyond the immediate circle of firelight, the darkness inside these dwellings was nearly as complete as the darkness outside. It is here, in this environment, in this cold, smoke-filled, dimly lit interior space, that the documentary's central argument must be established with clarity. Sleep in medieval Europe, for the majority of its population, was not a comfort. It was not a retreat into warmth and softness at the end of a difficult day. It was a survival act, performed on surfaces that offered no cushioning, in temperatures that offered no mercy, in air that offered no cleanliness. The act of lying down for the night in a peasant dwelling of the 13th or 14th century was an act of endurance before it was anything else. The sounds that accompanied this nightly endurance were not the sounds of peace. Wind moved through gaps in the wattle and daub walls with a persistence that varied from a low whisper to something closer to a moan, depending on the season and the direction of the prevailing weather. Timber beams contracted in the cold of deep night, producing sharp cracking sounds that punctuated the darkness without warning. Animals, whether livestock brought inside for warmth, or the rats and mice that colonized the floor straw, moved through the space with their own rhythms, indifferent to the sleeping bodies around them. Beyond the walls, the exterior night had its own acoustic texture. The sounds of a medieval village at night were not the sounds of silence. They were the sounds of a world without insulation, without the white noise of machinery, without the white noise of machinery, without any buffer between the human body and the raw environment. Wind in the tree lines, the distant call of nocturnal animals, the occasional sound of movement from neighboring dwellings, separated by only a short distance of bare earth. The camera, in this documentary, will not look away from these conditions. It will not soften the earthen floor or warm the colour of the smoke-blackened walls. It will dwell in the corners of these spaces, in the texture of matted straw and cracked earth, in the dim and shifting light of a fire that was always inadequate and always temporary. It will follow the arc of a single medieval might, from the moment darkness fell to the moment first light returned, not as a journey toward rest, but as a record of what endurance looked like when it had no other name. Break, time, equal sign, 1500 milliseconds. The focus narrows now. From the broad sweep of the medieval landscape, the fields, the tree lines, the stone towers of distant ecclesiastical structures, the perspective contracts to a single point, a single dwelling, a single interior. The fire burning low at the center of a packed earth floor, its light reaching only so far before the darkness of the room absorbs it entirely. The walls close in their rough, smoke-stained surfaces. The ceiling presses down with its burden of darkened timber, and on the floor, in the straw, in the cold, a body settling in for the night, not to rest, to survive until morning. The floor did not begin as a bed. It was simply the ground, the same ground that existed outside the dwelling's walls, compressed and shaped by the weight of daily life, until it became, by necessity and without alternative, the surface upon which the majority of medieval Europe's population spent every night of their lives. To understand what sleep meant in this era, one must first understand what the floor was, not as an abstraction, but as a physical substance with specific properties, specific failures, and specific consequences for every body that lay upon it. Earthen floors in peasant dwellings of the 13th and 14th centuries were formed through a process that was less construction than accumulation. The ground beneath a dwelling was rarely excavated or prepared in any deliberate sense. It was simply the existing soil compacted over time by foot traffic, by the weight of furniture and stored goods, by the slow pressure of habitation. In some dwellings, a mixture of clay, ash, and animal blood was worked into the surface to create a harder, more stable layer, a technique that produced a floor that was marginally more resistant to moisture, but still fundamentally porous, still fundamentally cold, still fundamentally of the earth rather than above it. The cold that rose from these floors was not the cold of a single season. It was a permanent condition, moderated slightly in summer, but never eliminated, and in winter transformed into something genuinely dangerous. The earth below a dwelling retained the temperature of the surrounding ground, a temperature that in the winter months of northern and central Europe hovered near or below freezing at depth and radiated upward through even the most compacted surface. A body lying horizontal on such a floor was in direct thermal contact with that cold, losing heat from below at a rate that no amount of surface material could fully arrest. Moisture compounded the cold. Earthen floors were permeable, and in the wet seasons that dominated much of the medieval European climate, groundwater moved upward through the soil by capillary action, keeping the floor surface perpetually damp. Rain that fell on the exterior ground migrated inward beneath the walls. Condensation from the warm, smoke-laden air above settled on the cooler floor surface. The result was a floor that was rarely, if ever, truly dry, a surface that combined cold with dampness in a combination that accelerated heat loss from any body in contact with it and created conditions favorable to the growth of mold, the survival of insects, and the gradual degradation of any organic material placed upon it. That organic material was overwhelmingly straw. Straw was the primary bedding material available to the medieval peasantry, not because it was well suited to the purpose, but because it was a byproduct of the agricultural labor that defined peasant existence. After grain was harvested and threshed, the remaining stalks were available in quantity, requiring no additional expenditure of resources to obtain. They were gathered, carried inside, and scattered across the floor in layers that served simultaneously as insulation, cushioning, and, in the absence of any alternative, a sleeping surface. The properties of fresh straw were, in isolation, not entirely without merit. Dry straw possessed some insulating capacity, trapping air within its hollow stalks and creating a modest barrier between a body and the cold floor below. It provided minimal cushioning, enough to soften the hardest irregularities of the earthen surface beneath, though not enough to relieve the fundamental pressure of bone against ground. But straw did not remain fresh. Under the conditions of a medieval peasant dwelling, it degraded with a speed and thoroughness that transformed it from marginal bedding into something considerably worse. The dampness of the floor worked upward into the straw from below. Time = 900 milliseconds. The moisture of human bodies, sweat, breath, the accumulated humidity of multiple people sleeping in a confined space, worked downward into it from above. Within days of being laid, straw in a peasant dwelling had begun to absorb moisture from both directions, losing its insulating air pockets as the hollow stalks collapsed and matted together under the weight of use. Within weeks, it had compacted into a dense, damp layer that offered almost no cushioning and significantly less insulation than it had when fresh. The cold from the floor below moved through it with increasing ease as its structure broke down. The straw was not replaced frequently. The labor required to gather, transport, and redistribute fresh straw was not trivial, and in the hierarchy of demands on peasant time and energy, the renewal of floor bedding ranked low against the imperatives of agricultural work, food preparation, and the maintenance of the dwelling itself. In practice, straw on a peasant floor might remain in place for weeks or months before being removed, accumulating filth, moisture, and biological material throughout that period in a slow process of degradation that the inhabitants of the dwelling lived within and upon every night. What accumulated in that straw was not merely organic debris. The floor of a medieval peasant dwelling was a shared space, shared by the human occupants, by any small livestock or poultry that might be kept inside, and by the populations of insects and rodents that colonize the straw ecosystem with a thoroughness that modern sanitation has made difficult to fully imagine. Fleas were endemic. lice were universal. Rats and mice moved through the floor straw as through their natural habitat, which, in the context of a medieval dwelling, it effectively was. The practice of mixing straw with rushes and bracken, plants gathered from wetlands and woodland margins, was common in many regions, and added variety to the floor covering, without fundamentally altering its properties or its fate. Rushes were somewhat more resistant to compression than straw and could provide a slightly more stable surface, but they too absorbed moisture, harbored insects, and degraded under use. Animal waste from livestock present in the dwelling mixed into this layer over time, contributing to both the biological richness of the floor ecosystem and the smell that permeated the interior space at all hours. A smell that was not background, but foreground, not incidental but defining. The physical consequences of sleeping on these surfaces accumulated in the body with the same slow inevitability as the degradation of the straw itself. A single mite on a hard, uneven floor produced the familiar aches of pressure points, hips, shoulders, knees, the bony prominences that bore the weight of a horizontal body against an unyielding surface. A lifetime of such nights produced something more systematic. The skeletal remains recovered from medieval peasant burial sites across Western Europe show patterns of joint deterioration, spinal compression, and bone stress that speak to chronic physical loading, bodies worn by labor, certainly, but also by the nightly failure of rest to provide any genuine recovery. Sleep itself was disrupted by the surface conditions in ways that went beyond simple discomfort. The pressure of a hard floor against soft tissue interrupted circulation, producing the familiar sensation of numbness that forced a sleeping body to shift position. A shift that, on a surface offering no comfort in any orientation, provided only temporary relief before the pressure accumulated again. The cold rising from below kept the body in a state of low-level physiological alertness, the nervous system responding to thermal threat even in sleep, preventing the deeper stages of rest that genuine physical recovery required. Winter transformed these already harsh conditions into something that crossed the boundary from discomfort into genuine danger. As temperatures outside the dwelling dropped below freezing, the earthen floor became a conduit for cold of a different order, not merely chilly, but actively hostile, drawing heat from anybody in contact with it at a rate that could, in the most extreme conditions, threaten life. Frost formed on the interior surfaces of stone walls, visible in the dim ember glow as a pale sheen on rough surfaces. The straw on the floor, already damp, could freeze at its lower layers, a layer of ice forming between the compacted bedding and the earth below, eliminating whatever marginal insulation the straw had retained, and replacing it with a surface that conducted cold more efficiently than bare ground. The visual texture of this environment, examined closely, was one of profound material exhaustion. The straw on the floor was not the bright gold of a freshly harvested field. It was the grey-brown of long compression and moisture absorption, matted into irregular clumps and flat patches that mapped the sleeping positions of the bodies that had lain upon it night after night. The earthen floor, visible at the margins, where the straw had been pushed aside or worn away entirely, had a dull, dark sheen the surface sealed by moisture and used into something that reflected the distant ember glow with a faint, cold light. In the corners of the room, where the straw accumulated in deeper drifts, pushed by foot traffic and the movements of sleeping bodies, the darkness was most complete. These corners were the coldest parts of the dwelling, furthest from the hearth, where the walls met and cold pooled with particular intensity. They were also, paradoxically, the most sheltered from the smoke that accumulated at ceiling level and the most removed from the ember risk of the central fire. A body in a corner was cold and in darkness, but it was also, in a narrow and grim sense, marginally safer than a body near the fire. This was the calculus of medieval sleep, not a choice between comfort and discomfort, but between different configurations of hardship: cold or smoke, ember risk or frost, the hard center of the floor or the damp margin near the wall. Every position offered its own particular form of suffering, and the body that lay down on the straw each night navigated these options not with deliberation, but with the exhausted pragmatism of a life in which no option was good and survival was the only standard by which any choice could be measured. The floor, then, was not merely a surface. It was an environment, complex, hostile, and alive in ways that worked against the body lying upon it at every hour of the night. The straw that covered it was not bedding in any meaningful modern sense, but a substrate of degraded organic material that harbored cold, moisture, and infestation in roughly equal measure. And the earth beneath that straw was simply the ground, indifferent, cold, and permanent, the foundation upon which the entire architecture of medieval peasant sleep was built, and the surface against which every morning a body rose not rested, but merely still alive. It burned at the center of everything. Not metaphorically, not as symbol or sentiment, but as a literal physical fact that organized every aspect of life within a medieval peasant dwelling, and none more completely than sleep. The open hearth was the single most consequential feature of the interior environment, the one element around which all other arrangements were made, all other conditions measured, all other decisions about where a body would lie at night ultimately resolved. To understand the geography of medieval sleep is, before anything else, to understand the geography of fire. The hearth in a typical peasant dwelling of the 13th or 14th century was not a fireplace in any architectural sense that the modern eye would recognize. There was no stone surround built into the wall, no iron grate suspending fuel above a controlled combustion chamber, no chimney drawing smoke upward through a sealed flue and expelling it cleanly above the roofline. In the simplest and most common form of peasant dwelling, the hearth was an open fire built directly on the earthen floor, or raised marginally on a flat arrangement of stones that served less as a structural feature than as a boundary marker, a way of defining where the fire was permitted to exist without preventing the smoke from going wherever it chose. The fuel that fed this fire was wood, gathered, cut, and stored with the same exhausting labor that characterized every other aspect of peasant resource management. In forested regions, wood was available but required constant effort to collect and process. In areas where woodland had been cleared for agriculture, fuel could be scarce enough that peat, dried animal dung, or bundled agricultural waste served as supplements or substitutes. The quality and quantity of available fuel determined the intensity of the fire, and the intensity of the fire determined the thermal conditions of the entire dwelling, a dependency so direct and so absolute that the management of fuel was not a domestic convenience, but a survival calculation performed every day and every night. The fire burned in open air within the enclosed space of the dwelling, and the smoke it produced had nowhere designed to go. In dwellings without any form of roof opening, smoke accumulated in the interior air with no exit, thickening until the environment became genuinely difficult to inhabit. In the more common arrangement, a hole in the thatch above the hearth, sometimes fitted with a simple wooden cover that could be partially closed against rain, allowed smoke to escape, but only after it had risen through the full height of the interior space, filling the upper portion of the room with a dense grey-brown layer that settled lower as the fire burned longer and the ventilation proved inadequate. This smoke layer was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a permanent feature of the interior environment, present every night that the fire burned, which was every night that survival required warmth. The layer accumulated at ceiling level and descended as the night progressed, its lower boundary dropping toward the floor as the volume of smoke exceeded the capacity of the roof opening to expel it. Every surface in the dwelling absorbed this smoke over time. The timber beams above, the wattle and daub walls, the straw on the floor, the clothing and hair and skin of every person within the space. The blackening visible on the interior surfaces of surviving medieval structures is not incidental decoration. It is the physical record of years of accumulated combustion, deposited layer by layer on every surface the smoke touched. For those sleeping closest to the floor, the smoke layer was above them, and in this narrow sense, their position offered a marginal respiratory advantage over those who remained upright. But the fire that produced the smoke also produced the heat that made the floor near the hearth the most desirable sleeping position in the dwelling, and so the two conditions were inseparable. Warmth and smoke arrived together, and any body positioned to benefit from one was positioned to suffer from the other. The thermal geography of a single-room peasant dwelling at night was not uniform. It was a landscape of temperature gradients, steep and unforgiving, organized entirely around the single point of the hearth. Immediately surrounding the fire, within a radius of perhaps 2 or 3 body lengths, the air was warm enough to be genuinely felt, the heat radiating outward in a cone that diminished rapidly with distance. This narrow band of warmth was the most contested space in the dwelling, the zone where the bodies of children, the elderly, and those most vulnerable to cold would be positioned, pressed as close to the fire as safety and space permitted. Beyond this inner ring, temperature dropped with a sharpness that was not gradual, but abrupt. The middle distance from the hearth, the area between the fire's immediate warmth and the cold margins of the room, was a zone of compromise, where some residual heat reached but where the cold from the floor and walls was already asserting itself with increasing authority. A body lying in this zone was neither warm nor fully cold, but existed in a state of thermal uncertainty that the body's own heat production struggled to resolve, particularly as the fire diminished through the night and the warmth it projected. contracted back toward its source. At the room's edges, against the walls, in the corners, in the spaces furthest from the hearth, the cold was comprehensive. The wattle and daub walls offered almost no insulation against exterior temperatures, and in winter the interior surface of these walls was cold to the touch, radiating chill inward. In the same way the floor radiated it upward. The corners where walls met were the coldest points of all, spaces where two cold surfaces converged, and the air had no path to the fire's warmth. A body pressed into such a corner was surrounded on two sides by surfaces conducting cold, lying on a floor conducting cold from below, and receiving almost nothing from the fire that burned at the room's center. The decision of where to sleep within this thermal landscape was not made freely. It was determined by the social hierarchy of the household, by age, by status within the family unit, by the particular vulnerabilities of each body. The positions closest to the fire went to those whose survival most depended on warmth: infants, young children, the sick, the elderly. Adult bodies with more robust thermal regulation were displaced toward the middle and outer zones, where cold was more severe, but where the risk of fire, of an ember landing on straw, of a sleeping body rolling too close to an open flame, was correspondingly reduced. That risk was not theoretical. An open fire burning on a floor covered with straw, in a dwelling whose walls and roof were themselves largely composed of organic material, represented a genuine and persistent danger to every sleeping body within it. The straw that served as bedding was the same material that served as kindling, dry enough to ignite from a displaced ember, close enough to the fire that the margin between warmth and catastrophe was measured in inches rather than feet. The management of the fire through the night, banking it down to reduce ember risk, maintaining it at a level that provided heat without excessive spark, was a task that required attention even during the hours when the household was nominally at rest. The fire also functioned as a temporal marker, its condition at any given hour of the night serving as a rough index of how much darkness remained. A fire, built up in the early evening, burned with relative vigor through the first hours of the night, providing its maximum warmth during the period when bodies were first settling onto the floor straw and the cold had not yet reached its overnight depth. As the night progressed and no new fuel was added, the fire diminished, the flames subsiding, the bed of coals contracting, the radius of warmth it projected shrinking back toward the hearthstones. By the middle of the night, what had been a fire was becoming an ember bed, still warm at its core, but no longer projecting heat with any meaningful reach into the room beyond. In the pre-dawn hours, the coldest period of the night, when exterior temperatures reached their lowest point and the dwelling's interior had been losing heat for many hours, the fire was often reduced to ash and a few glowing fragments that provided almost no warmth at all. This was the hour when the cold in the room was most absolute, when the floor straw was coldest, when the walls radiated chill most intensely, and when the bodies lying on the floor had been losing heat for the longest period. It was also the hour when the smoke layer, no longer fed by active combustion, had partially cleared, a grim exchange in which the air became more breathable, precisely as it became most cold. Into this thermal landscape, in the coldest months of the year, came another source of warmth that was neither comfortable nor optional. livestock, the animals upon which peasant households depended for labor, milk, and eventual meat, were brought inside during winter, not out of sentiment, but out of the same survival logic that governed every other decision in this environment. A cow, a pig, a small flock of poultry represented a significant investment of resources, and allowing them to die of cold in an unheated outbuilding, when they could be sheltered within the dwelling itself, was a loss that a peasant household could not absorb. The body heat produced by these animals was real and measurable. Single large animal generated warmth sufficient to raise the temperature of the immediate surrounding air by several degrees, a contribution that, in a dwelling where the difference between tolerable cold and dangerous cold was a matter of a few degrees, was genuinely significant. The animals were typically confined to one end of the dwelling, separated from the human sleeping area by a low partition or simply by convention, and their warmth radiated into the shared space with an indifference to the smell and noise they simultaneously contributed. That smell was considerable. The combination of animal bodies, animal waste, damp straw, smoke, and the accumulated biological output of multiple human beings in a confined space produced an interior atmosphere that was, by any modern standard, overwhelming. But in the context of a medieval peasant dwelling, this atmosphere was simply the atmosphere, the air that was breathed every night, that settled into clothing and hair, that was as unremarkable to those within it as the cold and the darkness and the hardness of the floor. Endurance required not the absence of these conditions, but the capacity to exist within them, without being destroyed. The hearth, then, was not merely a source of warmth. It was the organizing principle of the entire nocturnal environment, the point around which thermal gradients were arranged, social hierarchies were expressed in spatial terms, risks were distributed, and the long hours of darkness were measured. Its light was the last light visible before sleep, and the first sought upon waking. Its heat was the only heat available, and its diminishment through the night was the most consequential environmental event of every sleeping hour. Everything in the medieval night organized itself in relation to the fire, and when the fire went out, what remained was cold, darkness, and the long wait for morning. The distance between a peasant sleeping on damp straw and a lord sleeping beneath curtained hangings was not merely a distance of comfort. It was a distance measured in wood, stone, fabric, and the accumulated material consequence of centuries of social stratification, a distance that expressed itself most completely and most honestly in the hours of darkness, when the pretensions of rank were stripped back to their physical foundations, and what remained was simply a body, a surface, and the cold. Medieval hierarchy organized the waking world with elaborate ceremony and rigid convention. It organized the sleeping world with equal thoroughness, and the results were no less revealing. At the lowest register of this hierarchy, below even the peasant smallholder, with a dwelling of his own, were those whose sleeping arrangements offered no fixed surface at all. Landless labourers, itinerant workers, and the rural poor who moved between seasonal employment existed in a condition of nocturnal impermanence that made even the damp straw of a peasant floor seem like a form of stability. A barn floor, a stable corner, the covered space beneath an external staircase. These were the sleeping environments of those at the absolute margin of medieval society, surfaces that changed with circumstance and offered nothing beyond the minimal shelter of a roof overhead. Cold, hardness, and exposure were their permanent conditions, unmitigated by any fixed hearth or accumulated bedding. The peasant smallholder, by contrast, had at least the consistency of a known space. The earthen floor examined in the preceding sections of this documentary, cold, damp, covered in degraded straw, shared with animals and insects, represented not the worst sleeping condition available in medieval Europe, but something closer to the median experience of the rural majority. It was a condition of chronic discomfort rather than acute crisis, a nightly endurance that was sustainable across a lifetime, precisely because it was universal, and because no alternative existed against which it could be measured and found wanting. The peasant body lying on the floor straw did not know what it was missing. It knew only what it had, and what it had was the floor. Moving upward through the social structure, the first significant material improvement in sleeping conditions appeared not in the private chambers of the wealthy, but in the great halls of minor nobility, spaces that were themselves far removed from modern notions of comfort, but that represented a qualitative shift in the physical environment of sleep. The great hall of a minor castle, or fortified manor house of the 13th or 14th century, was a vast interior space. High stone walls rising to timber-framed ceilings, flagstone floors laid over rubble foundations, a central hearth of considerably larger scale than anything found in a peasant dwelling, but still fundamentally inadequate for the volume of cold air the space contained. These halls served multiple functions during the waking hours, as spaces for communal eating, for the conduct of household business, for the reception of visitors, and the administration of the lord's affairs. At night, the trestle tables that had served as dining surfaces were cleared to the walls or disassembled entirely, and the floor space they vacated became the sleeping area for the household servants, guards, and lower-ranking staff. The flagstone floor of a great hall was, in material terms, harder and colder than the earthen floor of our peasant dwelling. Stone conducted cold more efficiently than packed earth, and the height of the hall's ceiling meant that the heat from the central hearth dissipated upward before it could warm the air at floor level with any effectiveness. The bodies arranged on this flagstone floor were numerous. A functioning medieval household of any significant scale employed dozens of people, and the great hall at night was crowded with sleeping forms, servants, grooms, kitchen workers, men-at-arms, lying in rough proximity to one another, wrapped in whatever cloaks or blankets their rank entitled them to carry. Proximity to the central hearth was, as in the peasant dwelling, the primary determinant of thermal comfort, and the social hierarchy of the household expressed itself spatially in who slept closest to the fire and who was displaced toward the cold margins of the hall. Along the walls of the great hall, wooden benches provided an elevated sleeping surface for those of slightly higher standing within the household hierarchy. Senior servants, household officials, men whose rank placed them above the floor but below the threshold of private accommodation. These benches were hard, narrow, and cold, the wood conducting chill from the stone walls against which they were set, the surface offering no cushioning beyond whatever clothing could be folded beneath the body. The elevation they provided above the flagstone floor was marginal in thermal terms, but it carried social significance that was understood and enforced within the household's internal hierarchy. To sleep on a bench rather than the floor was to occupy a different position in the social order, even if the physical difference in comfort was difficult to measure. The straw pallet represented the next significant material improvement, a sleeping surface available to those of middling rank within a medieval household, and one that marked a genuine, if modest, advance over bare floor or bench. A straw pallet was constructed by stuffing a quantity of straw into a rough cloth sack, typically coarse linen or hemp, and sewing it closed to create a portable, self-contained sleeping surface that could be rolled up and stored during the day and unrolled at night. The cloth enclosure kept the straw from dispersing across the floor and provided a marginally more hygienic barrier between the sleeper and the straw's ecosystem of insects and accumulated debris. The insulating properties of a straw pallet were somewhat better than loose floor straw. The compression of the straw within the cloth casing created a denser layer that retained more air and provided more consistent cushioning than the irregular matted surface of scattered floor straw. But the pallet was subject to the same processes of degradation that afflicted all straw bedding. The straw within the casing compacted under use, losing its loft and its insulating capacity. Moisture penetrated the cloth and was retained within the straw, creating the same damp, cold conditions that characterized floor straw. Fleas and lice colonized the interior of the pallet with the same thoroughness they brought to every other straw surface in the medieval environment. The pallet was better than the floor. It was not, by any meaningful measure, good. Above the great hall and its sleeping arrangements, the private chamber of a lord or senior ecclesiastical figure represented the apex of medieval sleeping privilege, a space whose existence was itself a marker of exceptional rank, since the concept of a room dedicated to sleeping was not available to the vast majority of the population. The private chamber was separated from the communal spaces of the hall by walls and the door, a physical boundary that provided a degree of acoustic and thermal separation unavailable to those sleeping in the open hall below. The chamber was smaller, and its smaller volume was somewhat easier to heat, though the stone walls that surrounded it conducted cold with the same indifference as every other stone surface in the medieval built environment. Within this chamber stood the object that most completely symbolized the distance between privilege and poverty in the medieval sleeping world, the wooden bed frame. Elevated above the floor on legs of turned or squared timber, hung with curtains on a canopy frame that enclosed the sleeping space on multiple sides. The great bed of a medieval lord was a structure whose primary engineering purpose was thermal containment. The curtains that surrounded it were not decorative in origin, but functional, heavy fabric panels that trapped the heat of the sleeper's body within the enclosed space, reducing the rate at which that heat was lost to the cold air of the chamber. The elevation above the floor removed the sleeper from direct contact with the colder surface in the room, creating an air gap that provided modest but real insulation. The mattress that lay within this frame was stuffed with straw, wool, or horsehair, depending on the wealth of the household and the rank of the sleeper. Wool and horsehair represented improvements over straw, more resilient under compression, less susceptible to moisture absorption, more durable over time. But none of these materials produced a sleeping surface that approached modern standards of support or comfort. A mattress stuffed with compressed wool or horsehair was firmer than a straw pallet, but still fundamentally unyielding, still subject to the development of lumps and depressions under repeated use, still incapable of conforming to the contours of a body in the way that modern mattress technology takes for granted. Historical evidence also indicates that even the most privileged medieval sleepers rarely occupied their beds alone. The sharing of beds was not merely a peasant practice born of spatial necessity. It extended upward through the social hierarchy as a matter of both warmth and convention. A lord might share his bed with family members, with honored guests, or with personal attendants whose presence served both social and thermal functions. Only the very wealthy could afford the luxury of sleeping in isolation, and even among those who could, the cold of a medieval chamber made the warmth of additional bodies a practical consideration that often outweighed any preference for solitude. The ecclesiastical world produced its own distinct hierarchy of sleeping conditions, governed not by wealth alone, but by the rules and disciplines of monastic life. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, monks were required to sleep in a communal dormitory rather than individual cells, arrangement that prioritized collective oversight over personal comfort, and that subjected even the most senior members of many communities to the same shared sleeping environment as the youngest novice. Monks were directed to retire at approximately 7 in the evening and to rise for the night office of matins at around 2 in the morning, a schedule that imposed a structured interruption on the night's sleep that was not a natural adaptation to sleeping conditions, but a deliberate spiritual discipline. The monastic dormitory was a stone-floored, stone-walled space heated inadequately by whatever provision the community had made for warmth, and the wooden sleeping platforms or simple pallets available to monks represented a level of comfort comparable to the middling ranks of a secular household, better than the open floor, far short of the curtained bed. The senior clergy, abbots, bishops, and those of equivalent rank might occupy private chambers with more substantial sleeping arrangements, but even these spaces were subject to the same fundamental conditions of cold, hardness, and inadequate insulation that characterized every other sleeping environment in medieval Europe. What the comparison across this entire social spectrum reveals is not a gradient from suffering to comfort, but a gradient from acute suffering to chronic discomfort, a range of conditions that were all, by modern standards, inadequate, and that differed from one another in degree rather than in kind. The lord in his curtained bed was warmer than the servant on the hall floor, and the servant on the hall floor was warmer than the labourer in the barn. But none of them were warm. None of them were resting on a surface that supported the body adequately. None of them were breathing air that was clean, sleeping in spaces that were dry, or waking from nights that had provided genuine physical restoration. The curtains around the Lord's bed contained warmth, but also contained the same stale, smoke-touched air that filled every medieval interior. The wool mattress within the frame was better than straw, but still hard, still subject to infestation, still incapable of preventing the slow accumulation of pressure and discomfort through a long winter night. The private chamber was quieter than the great hall, but still subject to the cold that penetrated stone walls with patient indifference, still lit only by the dim glow of a fire or candle, still surrounded by the same darkness that swallowed every corner of the medieval world at nightfall. Rank in the medieval night, or degrees of insulation from the worst conditions. It did not buy escape from them. The cold that rose from the earthen floor of a peasant dwelling, and the cold that penetrated the stone walls of a lord's private chamber, were the same cold, the same indifferent physical force, working against every sleeping body in medieval Europe with equal persistence and without regard for the social distinctions that organized every other aspect of the world above it. Sleep was the great leveler, not because it made everyone equal, but because it made everyone, regardless of rank, a body in the cold, enduring the night. The night did not arrive gently. It arrived as an absolute, a condition that descended on the medieval world with the finality of a door closing, sealing everybody within whatever space it occupied at the moment of full dark and holding it there until dawn released it hours later. In the depths of a northern European winter, that interval could stretch to 14 hours or more. 14 hours of darkness, cold, and physical endurance on surfaces that offered no comfort and no relief. The night was not a pause in medieval life. It was an ordeal with a fixed duration, and the body that entered it had no choice but to endure until it ended. The transition into sleep began not at a chosen hour, but at the moment when the last usable light failed. In a peasant dwelling, this meant the fire had burned down to a level that no longer justified the expenditure of fuel needed to maintain it at working brightness, and the dim ember glow that remained served only to mark the hearth's location in the darkness, rather than to illuminate anything within the room. Bodies that had been seated near the fire, or moving through the small tasks of early evening, settled downward onto the floor straw, with the pragmatic resignation of people who had performed this same act every night of their lives, and expected nothing from it beyond the eventual arrival of morning. The settling of bodies onto the floor was not a single, simultaneous event, but a gradual process. Children first, then the elderly, then the adult members of the household, in rough order of their exhaustion and their position in the family's internal hierarchy. The straw beneath them received this weight with a compression that was by now familiar, the same matted surface, the same irregular lumps and flat patches, the same cold rising from the earth below, through whatever degraded insulation the straw still provided. The darkness around these settling bodies was not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn, but the darkness of a space from which all light had been genuinely removed. A darkness so complete that the distance between open eyes and closed ones was, in practical terms, nothing at all. In the early hours of the night, the fire still held enough residual heat to project some warmth into the space immediately surrounding the hearth. This was the period of the night most conducive to the first attempt at sleep, the body still carrying some warmth from the day's labor, the floor straw not yet at its coldest, the smoke layer above thinning slightly as the fire diminished and the ventilation of the roof opening worked with greater relative efficiency. Sleep, when it came in these early hours, was the lightest and most fragile version of itself, a shallow unconsciousness that the body's own thermal regulation and the physical discomfort of the surface beneath it kept from descending into anything deeper. What historians and medical researchers have documented about this period of sleep is striking in its consistency across the historical record. The pattern now described as segmented sleep, the division of the night into a first and second sleep separated by a waking interval, was not an anomaly or a dysfunction in the medieval world. It was the norm. For the 1,000 or so years that encompassed the Middle Ages in Western Europe, people commonly slept in 2 shifts. A first sleep beginning somewhere between 9 and 11 in the evening and lasting for roughly 4 to 5 hours, followed by a waking interval of an hour or more, and then a second sleep that extended until dawn. This pattern was not merely a social convention or a cultural preference. It was a rational physiological adaptation to sleeping conditions that made sustained unconsciousness across an entire night genuinely difficult to achieve. The cold that accumulated as the fire diminished, the physical discomfort of hard surfaces pressing against the body's pressure points, the noise of wind and animals, and the contracting of timber in the cold. All of these conditions worked against the maintenance of continuous sleep, pulling the body back toward wakefulness at intervals that the modern sleeper, insulated by mattresses and central heating and double glazed windows, does not experience. The waking interval between first and second sleep was not experienced as insomnia or as a failure of rest. It was simply a feature of the night, a period of low-level consciousness that occupied the middle hours of darkness and during which people performed small tasks, tended the fire, or lay in the particular state of relaxed wakefulness that the darkness and the quiet of the sleeping household permitted. Historical evidence suggests that this interval was sometimes used for prayer, for the performance of minor domestic tasks, or simply for lying in the darkness in a state that was neither fully asleep nor fully awake, condition that the medieval mind appears to have accepted as a natural part of the night's rhythm, rather than as a disruption of it. The fire, during this waking interval, required attention. A hearth allowed to die completely through the night was a hearth that would need to be rekindled from cold in the morning, a difficult and time-consuming process that represented a significant loss of warmth during the most vulnerable hours before dawn. The management of fuel through the night, adding wood or peat at intervals sufficient to maintain a bed of coals that could be coaxed back to flame, was a task that fell to whoever was awake during the waking interval, and the tending of the fire was among the most practical purposes that this middle-of-the-night wakefulness served. The physical environment during this waking interval was at its most stark. The fire, reduced to its lowest point before being tended, cast almost no light. The room around the waking body was as dark as the exterior night, the walls invisible, the ceiling absent in the blackness above. The cold in the room had deepened through the first hours of sleep, the floor straw colder now than when the household had first settled, the walls radiating chill with increasing intensity as the interior temperature dropped toward the exterior temperature that pressed against them from outside. The sounds of the night were clearer in this waking interval. Wind in the thatch above, the movement of animals, the distant sounds of a world that continued its indifferent operation, regardless of the sleeping or waking state of the bodies within the dwelling. After the waking interval, its duration varying from one night to the next, from one household to the next, governed by no clock, and measured by no instrument beyond the body's own sense of the night's progression, the second sleep began. This second sleep was, by most accounts, somewhat deeper than the first. The body having passed through its initial period of shallow rest and the waking interval, now settling into a heavier unconsciousness that lasted until the first light of dawn began to penetrate the oiled cloth or wooden shutters that covered the dwelling's small windows. But the conditions into which the second sleep descended were the harshest of the night. The pre-dawn hours, the period between roughly 2 and 4 in the morning, in winter represented the coldest point of the entire night cycle. Exterior temperatures reached their lowest at this hour, and the dwelling's interior, which had been losing heat steadily since the fire was last built up, was now at its coldest as well. The floor straw, damp from the moisture of sleeping bodies and the cold rising from the earth below, had reached a temperature that made it a conductor of cold rather than any kind of insulator. Frost had formed on the interior surfaces of stone walls, a pale, crystalline sheen visible in the absolute darkness only as a faint reflective quality on surfaces that were otherwise invisible. The body lying on the floor in these pre-dawn hours was a body that had been losing heat for many hours. Its muscles had stiffened in response to the cold, the joints that had been pressed against the hard floor for hours aching with a persistence that sleep could not fully suppress. The pressure points, hips, shoulders, knees that had been in contact with the floor surface had been deprived of adequate circulation for long enough that the discomfort they produced was no longer merely background sensation, but something that penetrated even the second sleep and worked at the edges of consciousness, pulling the body toward wakefulness before the night was fully done. The darkness at this hour was, paradoxically, deeper than at any other point in the night. The fire had been reduced to ash and a few cold fragments of charred wood, providing no light at all. The exterior darkness was at its most complete the hours before any hint of dawn, when the sky above the thatched roof was at its blackest and the absence of any artificial light source made the interior of the dwelling as dark as a sealed space. The quality of this pre-dawn darkness was different from the darkness of early night, heavier, more absolute, carrying in it the particular weight of an endurance that had already been long and was not yet finished. The sounds that accompanied these pre-dawn hours had their own character. Wind that had been a background presence through the earlier hours of the night often intensified in the small hours before dawn, driving cold air through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls, with a persistence that was felt as much as heard, a movement of cold air across the floor that reached sleeping bodies and worked against whatever warmth they had managed to retain. Timber beams contracted in the cold with sharp, sudden sounds that punctuated the darkness at irregular intervals. Animals in the dwelling stirred with increasing restlessness as the night approached its end, their own bodies responding to the cold and to the biological rhythms that preceded dawn. The body that had been lying on the floor through all of these hours, through the first sleep, the waking interval, the second sleep, and the brutal cold of the pre-dawn, was not a body that had rested. It was a body that had endured. The distinction is not semantic. Rest implies recovery, the restoration of physical and cognitive capacity through a period of reduced demand. Endurance implies the opposite, The expenditure of physiological resources to survive a hostile environment, the body working through the night to maintain its core temperature, to manage the discomfort of its sleeping surface, to sustain the minimal functions that kept it alive until morning. When first light finally penetrated the dwelling, a grey, cold illumination that entered through the oiled cloth covering the window, opening, and spread across the interior without warmth or drama. It arrived not as relief but as the signal that the night's ordeal had reached its conclusion. The bodies on the floor did not rise refreshed. They rose stiff, cold, aching in the joints and pressure points that had been in contact with the floor surface for hours. They rose into an interior that was at its coldest, its fire reduced to ash, its air carrying the accumulated chill of a night without adequate heat. They rose into a day that would demand from them the same physical labor that had preceded the night, without the buffer of genuine recuperation to bridge the gap. The segmented nature of medieval sleep, the first sleep, the waking interval, the second sleep, was not a comfortable arrangement or a charming historical curiosity. It was the body's negotiated response to an environment that made continuous sleep physiologically impossible, a pattern that distributed the night's endurance across multiple intervals of consciousness and unconsciousness in a rhythm that the medieval body had adapted to across generations. It was the best available solution to a problem that had no good solution. The problem of a human body that required rest being placed, night after night, in an environment designed by poverty and cold to prevent it. The long night of medieval Europe was not a night of sleep. It was a night of managed wakefulness, interrupted by shallow unconsciousness, of cold endured in stages, of a body working against its environment through every hour of darkness. Dawn did not end the suffering. It merely changed its form from the horizontal endurance of the night to the vertical labor of the day, with nothing in between that could honestly be called rest. The straw was never clean. Not on the first night it was laid, not in any season, not in any dwelling, across the breadth of medieval Europe's peasant landscape. From the moment it was gathered from the field and carried inside, it brought with it the biological complexity of the agricultural environment. The insects, the fungal spores, the rodent traces, the accumulated organic matter of a world without sanitation or separation between the human body and the living systems that surrounded it. What happened to that straw over the weeks and months it remained on the floor was not degradation in any simple sense. It was transformation from agricultural byproduct into a dense, layered ecosystem that harbored disease with the same thoroughness it harbored cold. The floor straw of a medieval peasant dwelling was, in ecological terms, a habitat. Its compressed layers provided shelter, moisture, warmth relative to the cold floor beneath, and an abundant supply of organic material in various stages of decomposition, conditions that were for the species that colonized it, close to ideal. Fleas arrived with the animals that shared the dwelling space and established themselves in the straw with a permanence that no amount of casual disturbance could disrupt. Their eggs, deposited in the deeper layers of the straw, where temperature and humidity were most stable, hatched into larvae that fed on the organic debris accumulating around them and pupated into adults that emerged ready to feed on whatever warm body lay nearest. The cycle was continuous, self-sustaining, and entirely invisible to the people sleeping above it. Lice occupied a different ecological niche, but were no less universal. Where fleas colonized the floor environment and moved between hosts opportunistically, lice established themselves directly on the human body. In hair, in the seams of clothing, in the folds of whatever fabric served as covering during sleep. The conditions of medieval sleeping, multiple bodies in close proximity, limited access to water for washing, clothing worn continuously through both day and night, were precisely the conditions under which louse populations thrived and spread. A single sleeping space, shared by several people, was in practical terms a single louse habitat, with the insects moving freely between hosts through the contact that shared bedding and proximity inevitably created. The discomfort produced by these infestations was chronic and unrelenting. The constant irritation of flea bites and louse activity, disrupting sleep at every hour of the night, adding its own contribution to the already formidable list of conditions working against genuine rest. But the significance of these insects extended far beyond discomfort. In the context of the medieval period, and particularly in the catastrophic decades of the mid-14th century, the flea was not merely an irritant. It was a vector of the most lethal disease in recorded human history. The connection between flea-infested sleeping environments and the transmission of plague, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death that swept through Europe beginning in 1347, was not understood by the people who lived and died within it. What they experienced was a disease that appeared to move through populations with terrifying speed and selectivity, striking households, villages, striking households, villages, and entire regions, without apparent pattern. What was actually happening in the sleeping spaces of medieval Europe was the nightly contact between human bodies and the flea populations that carried the bacterium from infected rodents to human hosts. The floor straw that served as bedding was the same environment that harbored the rat fleas responsible for transmission. Sleep, in this context, was not merely uncomfortable or physically damaging. It was, during epidemic periods, genuinely lethal. Typhus presented a parallel danger through a different vector. The body louse, endemic in the sleeping environments of medieval Europe, for all the reasons already described, was the primary carrier of Rickettsia proezechia, the bacterium responsible for epidemic typhus. Typhus moved through populations living in the close, unwashed, louse-infested conditions of medieval communal sleeping, with a consistency that made it a permanent feature of the disease landscape rather than an occasional catastrophe. The sleeping space, the shared straw, the shared blankets, the proximity of bodies through the long hours of the night was the transmission environment. The place where the louse moved from one host to the next and carried the disease with it. Beyond the insect vectors, the sleeping environment itself produced disease through mechanisms that required no intermediary organism. The smoke that filled medieval interiors every night the fire burned was not merely unpleasant. It was a chronic respiratory insult of considerable severity. The particulate matter produced by open combustion of wood, peat, and agricultural waste inhaled nightly by every person sleeping in proximity to an open hearth, accumulated in lung tissue over years of exposure, producing the progressive impairment of respiratory function that modern medicine associates with long-term exposure to indoor air pollution. The consequences were visible in the physical remains of medieval populations. Skeletal analysis from burial sites across Western Europe reveals evidence of chronic respiratory stress in individuals who spent their lives in smoke-filled interiors. The bone changes associated with persistent coughing, the dental wear patterns consistent with breathing through the mouth in response to nasal irritation, the general indicators of a respiratory system under sustained assault. Those who slept closest to the fire, the children, the elderly, the most vulnerable members of the household, positioned nearest to the hearth for warmth, were also those most intensely exposed to the smoke that the fire produced. Warmth and respiratory damage arrived together, inseparable consequences of the same necessary fire. Eye conditions were a related consequence of smoke exposure that would have been nearly universal in the medieval peasant population. Chronic conjunctivitis, the inflammation of the eye's outer membrane, produced by repeated exposure to smoke and particulate matter, was an inevitable result of sleeping in smoke-filled spaces night after night across an entire lifetime. The progressive impairment of vision that accompanied this chronic inflammation would have been accepted as a normal feature of aging, its connection to the sleeping environment entirely invisible to those experiencing it. The fire that kept a body alive through a winter night was simultaneously, over years of exposure, degrading the capacity of that body to see. Dampness operated as a separate but equally pervasive threat throughout the sleeping environment. The moisture that penetrated earthen floors from below, that condensed on cold stone walls and ran in rivulets down interior surfaces, that was retained in the compressed straw of floor bedding and pallets. This dampness created conditions favorable to the growth of mold and fungal organisms that produce their own respiratory hazards. Mold spores, released into the air of a damp, poorly ventilated interior space, were inhaled by sleeping bodies throughout the night, contributing to the chronic respiratory burden already imposed by smoke and particulate matter. The straw itself, perpetually damp and never fully replaced, was a substrate for fungal growth that would have been visible in the later stages of its use. The grey-white patches of mould developing in the deeper, wetter layers of the floor covering, invisible beneath the surface layer, but present and active in the biological environment that sleeping bodies inhabited. The smell that accompanied this fungal activity was part of the general olfactory landscape of the medieval interior, indistinguishable to those within it from the broader smell of smoke, animal presence, and human habitation that defined these spaces. But the respiratory consequences of inhaling mold spores nightly over years of exposure were real and cumulative, adding to the general deterioration of lung function that characterized the medieval peasant body in its middle and later years. The physical consequences of sleeping on hard surfaces operated on a different time scale, but with equal consistency. A single mite on a hard floor produced localized pressure injuries. The redness and tenderness of tissue compressed between bone and unyielding surface that disrupted circulation, that produced numbness and forced the sleeping body to shift position repeatedly through the night. Across a lifetime of such nights, These acute effects accumulated into chronic conditions that left their record in the skeletal remains of medieval populations. The patterns of joint deterioration visible in medieval skeletal material, the osteoarthritis of hips and shoulders, the spinal compression and disc degeneration, the bone remodeling associated with chronic pressure loading, are consistent with the physical demands of hard surface sleeping across decades of adult life. These were not conditions that announced themselves as sleep-related injuries. They were simply the physical state of a body that had worked hard and slept harder. The accumulated damage of a life in which no surface, waking or sleeping, offered the support that human musculoskeletal systems require to maintain their integrity over time. The aching joints and stiff backs that would have characterized a middle-aged peasant body were not incidental complaints. They were the physical record of every night spent on cold, hard, damp ground, a record written in bone and cartilage, and the slow deterioration of connective tissue that no amount of rest, in any modern sense of the word, was available to prevent. Fire presented a danger of a categorically different kind, not chronic and cumulative, but acute and catastrophic. The open hearth, burning in a space whose floor was covered with straw, whose walls were packed with organic material, and whose roof was thatched with dried plant matter, represented a fire risk of extraordinary severity. A displaced ember landing on dry straw could ignite within seconds. A fire spreading through floor straw reached the walls within minutes. A thatched roof, once ignited, burned with a speed and intensity that left no time for orderly evacuation, particularly for a sleeping population whose first awareness of the fire might be the heat and smoke of a space already fully involved in combustion. Historical records from the medieval period document the frequency of fire in settlements where thatched roofs and open hearths were universal features of the built environment. Entire villages burned. Individual dwellings were consumed with their occupants inside. The vulnerability of a sleeping population, unconscious, disoriented upon waking, in a space filled with smoke before the flames were visible, was a recognized feature of the fire risk, and the management of the hearth through the night was understood as a matter of survival rather than mere domestic maintenance. The particular danger of sleeping too close to the fire was not abstract. Children positioned nearest to the hearth for warmth were at greatest risk from displaced embers and from the spread of fire through the straw immediately surrounding the hearth. The same calculus that made the fire's immediate proximity the most thermally desirable sleeping position made it the most dangerous paradox that the medieval household navigated not through any systematic solution, but through the vigilance of whoever remained most likely asleep and most attentive to the fire's condition through the night. Taken together, the insect infestations and their disease vectors, the chronic respiratory damage of smoke exposure, the fungal and mold hazards of perpetual dampness, the musculoskeletal deterioration of hard surface sleeping, the acute fire risk of an open hearth in a straw-covered space, the sleeping environment of medieval Europe emerges not as a backdrop to the era's suffering, but as one of its primary mechanisms. The diseases that shortened medieval lives, the physical deterioration that aged medieval bodies prematurely, the catastrophic epidemics that periodically reduced entire populations, all of these had their point of contact with the human body in the same place, at the same time. in the sleeping space, in the night, on the straw. The floor was not merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous in ways that accumulated silently across years and decades, writing their consequences into the bodies of the living and the bones of the dead. Sleep, in medieval Europe, was the hour of greatest vulnerability, the period when the body lay still and open to every threat the environment contained, unable to move away, unable to defend itself, enduring in unconsciousness what it could not have chosen to endure in waking life. Dawn did not arrive as relief. It arrived as a grey, cold fact, a pale illumination that pressed through the oiled cloth, stretched across the dwelling's small window, opening and spread across the interior, without warmth, without drama, without any quality that distinguished it from the darkness it replaced, except that objects within the room became dimly visible again. The floor, the walls, the ash-grey remains of the hearth, the bodies on the straw, still horizontal, still pressed against the surface that had held them through the long hours of the night. Morning in a medieval peasant dwelling was not a beginning. It was the end of one form of endurance and the immediate commencement of another. The interior at first light was a space that bore the full record of the night that had passed through it. The hearth at the room's center was cold, not merely diminished, but extinguished, its fire reduced to a shallow layer of pale ash, and a few dark fragments of charred wood that held no heat and gave no light. The warmth that the fire had projected into the room during the early hours of the previous evening was entirely gone, replaced by a cold that had settled into every surface and every cubic foot of air, with the thoroughness of something that had been working its way inward all night. The interior temperature of the dwelling at dawn was as close to the exterior temperature as the walls and roof could bring it, which, in the winter months, meant a cold that was not merely felt, but inhabited. On the interior surfaces of the stone walls, where stone had been used in the dwelling's construction, at the corners and foundations where wattle and daub gave way to more permanent material, frost that had formed during the coldest pre-dawn hours was now beginning to melt. The pale crystalline sheen that had coated these surfaces in the darkness was releasing its moisture as the air temperature rose fractionally. With the arrival of daylight, and thin rivulets of water ran down the stone faces and disappeared into the earthen floor at the wall's base. This moisture joined the water already present in the floor, the groundwater rising by capillary action from below, the condensation that had settled on the floor's surface through the night, and the earthen floor at the wall's margins was at dawn wetter than it had been at any point during the previous day. The straw on the floor was in its worst condition of the cycle. A night of use had compressed it further, the weight of sleeping bodies pressing down on already matted layers, eliminating what little remaining loft the straw had retained, and reducing it to a dense, flat substrate that offered almost no separation between the bodies that had lain upon it and the cold, damp earth beneath. The moisture that sleeping bodies produced, the sweat of physical warmth seeking, the condensation of breath on cold surfaces, had been absorbed into the straw from above, meeting the moisture rising from the floor below, so that the straw at dawn was saturated from both directions. Its smell, always present, was at its most intense in the enclosed air of a space that had been sealed against the night. The accumulated biological output of multiple sleeping bodies The animal presence, the mold and decomposition working through the deeper layers of the floor covering, all of it concentrated in air that had not moved for hours. The bodies rising from the surface did not rise easily. The joints that had been pressed against the floor through the night, hips, shoulders, the bony prominences of knees and ankles, were stiff in a way that required deliberate effort to overcome the connective tissue having cooled and tightened through the hours of immobility. The muscles of the back and legs, which had been working throughout the night to maintain the body's core temperature against the cold rising from below, were fatigued in the particular way of muscles that had been working without rest. Not the clean tiredness of exertion, but the dull, persistent ache of sustained low-level effort that had produced no useful result. A body rising from a medieval floor at dawn was a body that had spent the night in a state of physiological labor, and it rose into the morning, carrying the full weight of that labor, without any of the recovery that genuine sleep would have provided. The cognitive state of these rising bodies was consistent with what modern sleep science describes as the consequences of chronic sleep deprivation, not the acute impairment of a single sleepless night, but the cumulative deficit of nights that had provided insufficient rest across weeks, months, and years. Attention was reduced. Reaction time was slowed. The capacity for complex judgment and planning was diminished in ways that were invisible to those experiencing the deficit, because the baseline against which impairment could be measured had never existed. A medieval peasant who had never experienced adequate sleep had no framework for understanding what adequate sleep would feel like, and no way of recognizing the cognitive and physical toll that its absence was continuously extracting. The skeletal evidence recovered from medieval burial sites across Western Europe provides the most direct physical record of what this lifetime of inadequate sleep and hard surface sleeping produced in the human body. The patterns visible in these remains are consistent and striking joint deterioration, appearing at ages that modern populations would not expect it, spinal compression, and disc degeneration in individuals whose other skeletal markers suggest they were not yet old, the bone remodeling at pressure points that indicates years of chronic loading against hard surfaces. These are not the remains of bodies that wore out from labor alone. They are the remains of bodies that were never adequately repaired, that went from the physical demands of the day directly into the physical demands of the night, with no interval of genuine recovery between them. The implications of this cycle extended beyond the individual body. Entire communities existed simultaneously in this state of chronic deprivation. Every adult, every aging body, every person whose physical capacity was the primary resource upon which household and village survival depended, operating at a level of cognitive and physical function reduced by the accumulated deficit of inadequate rest. The decisions made in this state about crops, about resources, about the management of illness and injury, and the countless small crises of subsistence existence were decisions made by minds working below their capacity, by bodies carrying pain and fatigue as permanent conditions rather than temporary states. There was no concept available in the medieval world that corresponded to sleep as a restorative luxury, as something that could be optimized, improved, or sought as an end in itself. Sleep was simply the night, the period of darkness during which the body lay down because there was nothing else to do and no light by which to do it. The idea that this period could be made more comfortable, that the surface beneath a sleeping body could be engineered to support it, that the temperature of a sleeping space could be controlled to prevent the cold from working against the body's recovery. These ideas were as remote from the medieval peasant's experience as any other feature of the modern world. The night was what it was. The floor was what it was. The cold was what it was. And the body endured all of it because endurance was the only option available. The cultural adaptations that allowed medieval populations to function within this condition of chronic deprivation were not dramatic or visible. They were embedded in the texture of daily life as unremarkable features of existence. The acceptance of physical pain as a permanent background condition, the absence of any expectation of morning freshness or cognitive clarity, the organization of labor and social interaction around bodies that were always, to some degree, depleted. The medieval day began, not from a position of restored capacity, but from the position at which the previous day had ended, with the night's endurance added to the accumulated deficit of all the nights before it. The segmented sleep pattern that characterized the medieval night, the first sleep, the waking interval, the second sleep, left its own particular mark on the morning body. The waking interval in the middle of the night, during which the fire was tended and small tasks were performed, meant that the second sleep was often the deeper of the two periods, and the body woken from it at dawn was woken from a sleep that had only recently reached its greatest depth. The transition from this second sleep to the demands of the waking day was abrupt, the grey light of dawn providing no gradual transition, no period of quiet wakefulness before labour began, only the immediate replacement of one form of endurance with another. As the dwelling's occupants rose and moved through the first tasks of the morning, rekindling the fire from whatever coals had survived the night, beginning the preparation of food, attending to the animals that had shared the sleeping space, the interior environment began its slow daily transformation. The fire, once rekindled, began again to project warmth into the space it had abandoned through the pre-dawn hours. The smoke that accompanied it began again to accumulate at ceiling level, the familiar grey-brown layer reforming above the heads of the people moving through the space below. The straw on the floor, disturbed by the movement of rising bodies, released its accumulated smell into the warming air. The dwelling was returning to its daytime condition, which was not a better condition than its nighttime state, only a different one, organized around different demands and different forms of discomfort. Outside the dwelling, the village was emerging from the same night. Smoke began to rise from the roof openings of neighboring structures, thin columns of grey against the pale winter sky, each one marking a hearth being rekindled, a household beginning the same transition from horizontal endurance to vertical labour that was occurring in every dwelling across the settlement. The fields beyond the village boundary were emerging from darkness as the light strengthened. Bare earth, frost stiffened in the winter months, the furrows of previous ploughing, visible as dark lines across pale ground. The landscape that had been swallowed by darkness the previous evening was returning to visibility, unchanged, indifferent, waiting for the labour that the day would bring. The cold morning air that moved across this landscape carried no warmth and offered no comfort. It was the same air that had pressed against the dwelling's walls through the night, the same cold that had worked its way through wattle and daub and earthen floor and degraded straw to reach the bodies sleeping within. In the morning it was simply outside rather than inside, a distinction that mattered less than it might seem, given how thoroughly the exterior environment penetrated the interior of every peasant dwelling in the medieval landscape. The night just past was not exceptional. It was not a night of unusual hardship or particular suffering that would be remembered and recounted. It was simply a night, one unit in an unbroken sequence of identical nights that stretched backward through every previous winter and forward through every winter to come, each one presenting the same cold, the same hard floor, the same degraded straw, the same insufficient fire, the same interrupted and inadequate sleep. The people rising from the floor of a medieval peasant dwelling at dawn had no expectation that the following night would be different, because it would not be. The cycle had no end point, no improvement on the horizon, no technology or material or social development that would alter its fundamental character within any time frame that the living could anticipate. This was the texture of medieval existence at its most fundamental level, not the dramatic suffering of plague or famine or warfare, though those too were features of the landscape, but the quiet, continuous, unremarkable suffering of bodies that were never adequately rested, never genuinely warm, never free from the physical consequences of sleeping on cold ground, in damp straw, in smoke-filled spaces, night after night, across an entire lifetime. It was suffering so universal and so constant that it did not register as suffering to those within it, only as the condition of being alive, the baseline against which nothing better could be measured because nothing better had ever existed. The documentary's lens, pulling back now from the interior of the single dwelling it has inhabited through these chapters, moves outward through the oiled cloth of the window opening and into the cold morning air of the village. The thatched roofs with their rising smoke, the bare earth paths between dwellings, frost-hardened and empty in the early light, the fields at the settlement's edge, stretching away toward the tree line where the forest began and the cleared land ended, the pale sky above it all, offering light without warmth, visibility without comfort, the beginning of another day that would end, as all days ended, in another night on the floor. The night was not an interruption of medieval life. It was medieval life, the same endurance, the same cold, the same body working against an indifferent environment, with the only tools available to it, which were its own persistence and the absence of any alternative. Morning came. The fire was rebuilt. The straw was stepped over and around, its replacement deferred again to a later day that would itself be deferred. The body that had lain on the floor through the darkness straightened itself against its stiffness and moved toward the door, toward the cold air, toward the fields and the labor and the long day that stood between one night and the next. And in the evening the darkness would return, and the body would lie down again, and the floor would be waiting,